Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Peter Marsden. I'm Concordis Chief Executive, and we'd like to follow Search for Common Ground's excellent presentation by getting into a little more into the granularity of the dynamics between herders and farmers, presenting recommendations from the communities for interventions that they believe will make a real difference in this very fragile context. Now, this follows about 6 years of peace building work, including consultation with 3,417 people and ongoing workshops and dialogue, bringing together different stakeholders, herders, farmers, local authorities, even members of armed groups, and helping them to identify and address root causes of the conflict, but also to find opportunities for synergy and trade in goods and services to mutual economic benefit. And so they found, firstly, CAR has huge economic interdependencies between herders and farmers. Despite all of the bellicose rhetoric, this presents some really interesting opportunities for social cohesion. Secondly, the local authorities have a huge role. Now, you'll have heard the narrative that the state has very limited capacity outside Bangui, but I have to say we found fantastic examples of prefects, sub-prefects, mayors, of traditional leaders, both herder and farmer, who are really capable and really trusted by the communities to manage conflicts and resolve disputes that arise in their area. You know, people say that peaceful transhumance works when the herders check in with the authorities on arrival, and when those authorities communicate or announce that arrival to the wider community. And it works when there's a competent authority that is accepted by all sides to resolve disputes quickly as they arise. You know, when that is in place, when it's working and accepted, that massively lessens the incentives on people to take their disputes to armed groups. Thirdly, it's really important to tie together the local and the regional, since both the local and regional economies massively depend on movement of people, goods and livestock across international borders. You know, we asked herders why they were taking clandestine border crossings, not using the formal or traditional routes. And they said 3 reasons. One, the traditional routes, it's just a chicken run for predation by bandits. They weren't protected. 2, they said that they found it really difficult because they would be taxed by the Chadian authorities, they'd cross the border and be taxed again by the Central African authorities, and then they'd be taxed again by one or more armed groups, and then still they'd be expected to provide financially for the host communities. And this was too much. Thirdly, they were saying that even if they do pay this tax, they don't get provided with security on the route or with veterinary services. And often the providers of those veterinary services have been scared off by the presence of armed groups. So this really is the Hobbesian social contract of transhumance. Herders made it quite clear that they would be willing to pay tax if that is in exchange for security and for veterinary services. And this presents a real opportunity. We work with the authorities from both sides, the local authorities from both sides of the border, enabling them to come up with bilateral arrangements around security, taxation and provision of services. And this changes the incentives on the herders. And it also enables the government to collect revenue. Fourthly, the changing patterns of transhumance in Central African Republic. You'll have heard the narrative. This is all about well-armed foreign transhumants, young men moving large herds of cattle for wealthy owners, all with no respect for the local customs and the traditional transhumance routes. Now, we could talk a lot the displacement of semi-settled transhumants from Western Car and their displacement during the crisis into Cameroon. We could talk about the replacement of them from Chadian Pearl who are moving into this zone. We could talk about the interactions in the northeast of Car between Arab and Pearl herders, with the local conflicts between Runga and Gula groups, but maybe that's for another time. Here are the opportunities that these changing dynamics bring as the local communities see them. Many of the young men are indeed travelling alone without their families, and many of them are perceived to be a threat by the local population. But many are actually on reconnaissance, working out whether next year it might be safe enough for them to bring their wider families. A number of groups faced with depleted grazing in Chad and in Sudan for a number of different reasons, they have a strong push to spend more time in Car. And actually some of them say that they even hope to base their families as semi-settled farmers, semi-settled herders in Central African Republic. Now, you don't need lessons in game theory from me, but where you have these kinds of repeated transactions, an intention of repeated interaction, well, actually that changes the incentives on people. People have an incentive to make sure that these interactions, these negotiations are mutually acceptable. And so we see this as quite a critical moment, really making sure that these new patterns of transhumance are peaceful, making sure that they are taxed, and making sure that they bring real, tangible benefits to the settled population, including, of course, fertilisation of fields, traction and trade in goods and services. Fifthly, we would be remiss not to talk about the armed groups. This is a very fast changing power dynamic, and it's really not for us to talk about the decision of the Central African government to bring foreign fighters to aid them in their war on the coalition forces, though it would be right to say that local populations have quite a lot to say about that. We found that people's relationship with the armed groups is complex. Many people complain about their presence, and they say that even the groups set up to protect them often predate on the very people they were ostensibly set up to protect. At the same time, a small minority of herders and actually a larger minority of the settled population also admit to supporting the armed groups to some extent. And a key question we found is, if you ask people, if you were in trouble, if you were attacked, would you contact the local armed group? 95% of herders say yes, they would. And actually, it varies depending across the geography, but the majority of the settled population also admit, no, we would also contact the armed group if we were attacked. And the recommendation here is really that it's very, very important to address the reasons why there are armed groups, rather than just focusing on crushing the armed groups militarily and expecting that to resolve the problem. Sixthly, just as it's important to engage with those who choose to take up arms, it's also just as important to engage with those who choose not to take up arms. And it is vital to engage with women, both given some of their vulnerabilities to the conflict, but also as proactive agents of change.
En République centrafricaine, les femmes jouent un grand rôle dans la gestion des conflits. D'abord, en temps de conflit, la femme est à la fois victime et facilitatrice. En tant que victime, lorsqu'il y a un conflit, l'homme quitte le foyer, la femme est abandonnée à elle-même à s'occuper des enfants. Et en plus de cela, pendant les conflits, la femme est considérée comme un objet sexuel. Face à toutes ces difficultés rencontrées, la femme conseille généralement aux hommes, à ses enfants comme à son mari, d'opter pour la paix, les gestes pacifiques, c'est-à-dire abandonner la violence, pratiquer toujours la paix, la conciliation, afin qu'il n'y ait plus à l'avenir un prochain conflit.
Seventhly, and finally, as the conflict begins to subside, it's actually becoming possible to resume the protection of Central African Republic's national parks. And this presents really important opportunities, but also real threats to social cohesion. Now, our friends at FAO are working with some of Concordis colleagues trying to find a peaceful solution to the many thousands of cattle which are at this moment sort of moving into the national park in Bamingui Bangaran. People from all sides of this conflict dynamic are very worried that an overzealous approach to guarding the parks will actually lead to more inter-community violence. And people are asking for participatory solutions to these very complex problems, working out how the natural resources of the park can be protected and managed in a way that actually gives mutual benefits to all of the population, both herder and settled farmer. If this can be achieved, then people are much more likely to protect the natural resource that is the park. And frankly, this summarises the whole approach. As one of our workshop participants said, the difference between sensibilisation and dialogue, if the rules are made collaboratively, then people are much more likely to adhere to them. But if they're made remotely and then imposed on the population without any kind of discussion, the situation becomes very much more antagonistic. So more of these collaboratively made recommendations are set out in Concordis's reports, as well as the reports of our friends at Search for Common Ground and Invisible Children. And the links to those, I think, are being placed in the chat now. But we're a dialogue organisation, so I am really looking forward to the questions that you may have for us and our team. Thanks very much.